welcome to Mosov's Meetup on APIs over IPAs. Joining us today is Tyler from Dell Technologies Capital. He's going to be speaking on his developer-led landscape. We'd love to just hear first, what is a developer-led landscape?
Well, thank you for having me. It's nice to be here this evening. We actually have a bit of a full house, so that's awesome to see. The developer-led landscape is a database of companies I started building in 2009, where I decided I wanted to track all the commercial entities that were building products either purchased by developers, influenced purchase by developers, or consumed directly in their day-to-day activity. And the first version of that database had about 150 companies in it. And the version that I just put out has 1,400 companies in it now.
Wow, that's a lot of developer companies. Where do you find these companies?
Scouring the web, referrals, introductions, evaluating them for potential investment. They come get introduced. Reading Hacker News like the rest of you. But just the daily research exercise, and you start to hear about all these companies, and I keep the database up to date.
Awesome. So what are some new trends you've seen this past year that you haven't seen before in 2021 or 2020?
Over the past 24 months, we've seen an acceleration in the number of new companies that have been introduced. To give a sense, in 2020, there were only 750 or so companies in the database, so it's almost doubled in 24 months. That's not a sustainable path. As a result of that, the number of specialties that exist, so we categorize it, we break it down, we look at companies that are doing like-minded things, and we label them. And so the number of specializations has increased, which is good generally for the industry, but kind of challenging because we're getting narrower specializations, and so those are mini markets, if you will. A little bit harder to have successful outcomes on that as opposed to bigger, broader markets on that front. So those are two things that have happened. Other things that have happened too is the pace of venture capital that has flown into these companies. It's probably about 3 times what it was in the 2 years. It's like 2018 versus 2020. That's also not sustainable. I think it's something like in the past 24 months, something around $100 billion in venture capital has flown into these companies, and there's only been about $40 billion in liquidity events, either through an IPO or an acquisition or something like that. So $40 billion coming out of the market, $100 billion going in. That $100 billion maybe acquired 20 to 25% of these companies. So you're looking at the database of active companies is probably getting close to $1 trillion of value. And so you have to wonder where where all those IPOs going to happen, or who's going to acquire all these things, and how are these companies going to unlock that value that they've been trying to create.
Wow, $1 trillion in value. It's crazy that you also, you speak on peak DevOps, and what does that mean? And when we think about DevOps roles, there's, I don't know how many different roles we have. We have DevSecOps, we have Cloud DevOps, automation engineers. What does it mean for an individual developer looking to join DevOps? And what does it mean for all these different DevOps companies?
Well, so first I'll say, peak DevOps is a term that I came up with. I coined it in, a release that I put out. It's a fairly controversial term, and it's based upon a mega theory that I have of the DevOps marketplace, which is that the marketplace goes through what I call these industrialization cycles that last about 40 years each. And we're in the middle of the second industrialization wave of software. I believe there's a third one that's going to come. And it just so happens that we're at the peak of the second one. And these waves are determined by the way in which developers get feedback about the software that they're building. And that basic paradigm defines a whole set of best practices, policies, processes, tools, and the way we go about building software. And the first wave really ended in about 2005, and I call that the waterfall wave, which was, a basic premise of, we're going to design some software and then we're going to take 3 to 9 months to implement it, ship it, and then we need 3 to 6 months to get a bunch of feedback on that, and we repeat the cycle. And the entire ecosystem of companies that were created, built, emerged, and existed were designed around this basic paradigm, right? The runtime platforms, the tools, it was all around that paradigm. And it turned out there was about $50 billion of market value that was created in that period that started in roughly 1965 and ended in 2005. Git came along, and the Agile Manifesto. Git came along in 2005. The Agile Manifesto came out in 2002, and that was a paradigm shift that said, oh, the basic idea is the faster we can get input or feedback from end users, and the faster we can act on that input and make a change and get it back out to end users, that is just better software. It's going to be cheaper to make. Developers are going to enjoy making the software more. And the industry that we have today, which is about 17 years later, most of these 1,400 companies are companies that specialize in providing some form of automation of that agile workflow that developers need to work on. And it just so happens that this current market value is somewhere between $500 billion to $1 trillion. So it's about 10 times bigger than what the previous wave was. And we're 17 years into it, which is about halfway through the 40-year cycle. And if you go and look at the first industrialization wave that lasted 40 years, the first 25 years were a fragmentation epoch where lots of things were getting introduced. We were trying to figure out what the best practices were. There were specialty companies that showed up at each step of the process. And then the last 15 years were people going, oh, now we figured it out. It's kind of costly and expensive and difficult for us to buy a bunch of different point tools and integrate them together. So let's go through a consolidation epoch. And so we then have the platforms emerge, and the platforms in the first wave were IBM and Microsoft, Oracle, a couple of others. Well, peak DevOps means that we are at the peak of the Agile wave. We're probably witnessing peak fragmentation. There's a bunch of reasons why I think this, but we're starting to see the evidence of what will be a 15 or 20-year consolidation wave. So what happens in a consolidation wave? Consolidation wave means lots of wipeouts from a lot of niche vendors that don't get to be large enough to be sustainable on their own, or can raise enough money, or they don't get acquired. You get 2 to 4 mega platforms that emerge. And those mega platforms, they basically say, hey, we're going to have a highly opinionated approach. We're not going to give you as much flexibility, but we're going to integrate a lot of the plumbing for you. And that's generally a fine trade-off for most organizations to achieve what they need to do. And that'll play itself out. And those platform vendors, they get really good at driving cost efficiencies down. And so they can start offering prices that the niche vendors just can't compete with over time. And it takes 15 or 20 years to play itself out. I think that's going to happen, and it has to happen. And the trigger here is that we've just introduced too much complexity into the development process. It's a pretty controversial position that I've taken because I'm a big advocate for developers. But when you look at it, there's massive demands for new software to be built. And then yet the rate of developers that are being introduced into our ecosystem is not growing at a fast enough rate. It's roughly 2 to 3% a year. And there's a lot of analysts who think it's going to grow and get to like 50 million developers. But the reality is that the average lifespan of a professional developer is roughly 16 to 18 years. And this is backed up in data. You can look at labor statistics, salary data, Stack Overflow's developer survey. And developers just work themselves out, and they work themselves out because of burnout. The rate of change of the technology is just too fast. So you have to be doing your job, and you have to be studying technology all the time. Developers are not necessarily respected. They're treated as resources as opposed to a talent class on that reason. And so developers are heavily compensated versus other skilled practitioners out in the industry, like firemen or construction workers. And they're heavily compensated because the rate of learning is much higher. And there's a bunch of academic studies that show this, that because you have to be on a constant retraining skill curve, you have to get compensated for that because the half-life of your knowledge is roughly 18 months in many ways, right? But that's very different than like a woodworker, where once they have that skill, it's probably a lifelong skill for them. So, so your compensation has to, compensate you for the risk of the half-life. And so because of this issue, then you marry that with the paradigm of the agile wave, the second wave that we're in. And what agile says is ship faster, get feedback faster, and you have better end users. Well, if you take that to its natural conclusion, it says continuously ship, continuously get feedback. And that, if you're a developer, is an unsustainable position to be in. No, there's no person on the planet that can take the fire hose of data on a 24/7 basis and then incorporate that, assess that, make constant changes, and keep repeating this cycle. So if you take agile to its natural conclusion, it says go to infinity. And infinity is not sustainable. And I think agile is the root cause of why we have such high attrition in the industry on this front. So, so you get developer burnout. You're not going to get as many developers who enter the industry, or at least the number of developers entering the industry matches those that are leaving it. And you have this agile philosophy, which has a lot of great and wonderful tools in it, but frankly, developers aren't really all that satisfied about the way that they work. So the consolidation will then happen because vendors will come in and try to do automation. They'll come in and try to integrate these tools together. They'll try to provide a solution that tries to alleviate the burdens that are taking the stresses away from developers, but they'll only get so far. So there's a number of theories out there that says complexity can only be managed. It can't be eliminated under a certain paradigm. So there's actually a waterbed systems of is it a theory or a system? Can't remember the exact word, but it was coined by the guy who invented Perl. And complexity is like a waterbed. If you see, a bubble in the waterbed and you push it down, great, you solve that bubble, but what happens, right? The bubble just crops up somewhere else, right? So complexity in software is like a waterbed. You're just a little bit like whack-a-mole. At least you never really hit the mole, right? Here with the waterbed, you're pressing things around. So as long as we stay within this current paradigm, right, we're probably going to have to embrace this level of complexity. So, I'm not usually one to make predictions, but in this time, I'm sitting here going like, well, the next 10 or 15 years is going to be a consolidation wave, but then what happens after that? And, my theory is that, okay, the only way we're going to be able to meet the demand for software that has to be built is we have to change the paradigm. So if waterfall was about, getting long forms of feedback, if agile was about continuous feedback from humans, then the next wave would be autonomous development, which is continuous feedback handled by machines. And if you think about it, the basic premise of, if we can make changes very quickly, end users are going to be more satisfied. That's a good premise. But maybe humans aren't in the best position to absorb all that feedback and then to reason about the change that they're going to make, because the change affects huge code bases, complicated architectures, lots of tools on that. Very difficult for a human to reason about the impact of a single change that they're going to make. But machines, which use statistical models, are probably pretty good about reasoning that. So if we really wanted to go to a third wave of industrialization, I think we get to a point where the software is constructed and maintained by machines, which are directed and instructed by humans and fed by data, which is the culmination of our experiences over the past 80 years. And when you look at everything that's emerging in the machine learning space, the MLOps space, and the richness of the data that we've got, my estimation is that we'll see real systems show up in about 10 to 15 years on that front. And that would be a whole new wave. There's probably $5 trillion of value that'll be created in that wave. And as an investor, that's what I'm betting on.
Nice. It's really interesting to think about consolidation in the dev tool space. But we've seen like different types of consolidation. I mean, GitLab does a great job doing end-to-end CI/CD.
Yep.
You've seen things like the Kubernetes ecosystem, more from the open source community. So what's going to be driving this consolidation? Is it a large company doing M&A and joining forces? Is it going to be a new open source ecosystem, or is it something else?
Well, so in order for consolidation to happen, there has to be some sort of concentration that you start with, right? And so you leverage that concentration to build value add around that. And GitLab's point of view is that they started with the version control system. They had a simple installable version control system, and they're building out the rest of the components around that. Microsoft's approach is community, community, community. You have a richness of community, and then you can leverage on value add solutions in and around that. CloudBees and Circle CI believe that the CI system is the only thing that has visibility to the code that's being built and to the components that are running in production. So they see themselves as a potential consolidator because they can bridge those two worlds. So there's got to be some concentration of that. Now, how do you do how do you actually do the consolidation? Well, you either have to build functionality or you have to acquire it. I mean, it's really the only two ways. GitLab has been they used a lot of hundreds of millions of dollars of investor money to rapidly build out what I would consider a good enough quality, but very, very basic, but good enough quality stuff so that they could check all the boxes as quickly as possible. And then what they really innovated on, their innovation was on not on much on their functionality that they provided, but they innovated on a pricing model, which their internal philosophy, which they really don't want people to know much about, is that anything that a developer really needs to touch or use actively, give that away for free, and anything that's related to security, right, or legal or governance, we're going to premium the hell out of that. Right, so get the developers on, get the motion going, and then you go to the businesses and say, well, the security testing or the pen testing or the whatever it's going to be is going to be $100 per developer per month. So they really innovated on that, and that took a lot of the win out of the sales on GitHub because GitHub was really directly trying to monetize the developer itself. So GitLab did a great job on that front.
Is that why the Okta integration costs so much?
And not only that, but GitHub CoPilot, $10 a month for that. I mean, that's ridiculous. What's that? Unless you're open source, yeah, as an open source developer. But if you're an open source developer working for a commercial company, not so much, right? But I think the real reason that they went with a pricing model is the legal issues. I think they're scared out of their wazoo. And if you go read the terms and conditions, if you sign up for the subscription, you're waiving a lot of you're giving them kind of a free and clear. So I think that they're not going with the free option because they've taken a lot of existential risk on that.
Copilot's a really interesting product, but does that introduce any legal risk for the organization? And what do we think of all these different, auto-completion tools?
So in terms of the auto-completion tools, there's only three. There's Kite, which is now out of business, and they raised $17.5 million. There's Tab 9, which used to be named Cadota. They just announced their Series A. They're humming along, right? I know they have some revenues and they're reasonably popular, but they're not based upon as nearly as a large of an open source dictionary of code, if you will. And then you've got GitHub CoPilot on that front. And and Tab 9 is differentiating itself from GitHub CoPilot because they do have a free tier, and also you can train it on. You can basically take the models that they use and say, hey, we don't want your models to use the public domain stuff. We only want the models to work off of the private stuff. So you can get a guarantee on that what it was trained on was something that maybe you have copyright or intellectual property controls over. Whereas GitHub is playing in this wonderful world of, hey, we've got 35 million accounts on our system, and so we're just going to scour all the open source and then come up with a lot of legal explanations that even though there's some verbatim open source code that it's regenerating, that somehow that is legally not a relicensing or a recopying of other person's licensed stuff. But I think the net of it is that Microsoft has their explanation for why this is okay And there's a lot of lawyers out there who are trying to analyze this, and it probably is going to go to the courts at some point in time and need to get resolved. There,
Interesting,
yeah.
interesting. So if you look back in the late 90s and early 2000s, we had .NET engineers. You can almost be called a Microsoft engineer. Is that what's going to happen? You're going to be a GitLab engineer, Kubernetes engineer, and so on?
Well, I think it's easy to argue that 20 years ago, when you looked at a software project, 80% of it was actually code that was written, and 20% was composition, and maybe another 10% was the tooling around that. Now you've got 90% for the tooling. Then you got the next 8% is the composition, and then maybe there's 2% of actual coding, at the end of the day there. So we really inverted it, and most of the time is spent in the pipelining, maintaining the pipelining, and then the composition side of it, and not so much on the writing the code. So yeah, you could look at yourself as, hey, am I an agile specialist, agile tool specialist, and what can I, sling out of that, and less of a, am I a stack developer of a certain kind here?
Indeed. What is the next big wave? We talked about dev tools quite a bit, but you have a lot of other categories inside your landscape.
Yeah, one, I think we're going to see progressive delivery become a best practice. So instead of CI, CD, and experimentation as these independent metrics, I think you see a large recognition that everything from the moment the code is checked in all the way through to it's in production with observability are all part of a continuum. And that continuum needs to be interlinked and sharing data all continuously, and not residing in different silos. So I think that one is one substrate that is very natural, and you get all sorts of benefits by treating it as one substrate. That's one thing. The second thing is that when you think about the pipeline system that we have today, the assets, whether it's code or the artifacts or the tests, whatever it may be, they kind of move from one environment to the next, right? So it's copy and then execute a bunch of scripts, and then copy and then execute a bunch of stuff. And that kind of process is pretty error prone and very difficult to maintain. And I think we're going to start to recognize that, when you're building a software system, you have multiple environments that exist in lots of different locations, and that those environments need to exist in some sort of symbiotic relationship with each other. So if all the environments understand that they exist as part of a pipeline, then there can be an underlying substrate that takes responsibility for moving the assets and reconfiguring things appropriately without having a lot of complicated pipelines. So I think we're going to see a redefinition of the whole configuration management, provisioning, and maintenance of these environments. That'll be a pretty big trend. The next thing is that it seems pretty inevitable that people are tired of overpaying for all the observability tools that are out there. So those are going to be consolidated down. So you get your traces, your metrics, your logs, your debugging information, your memory snapshots, everything that you need into a singular system that works both in pre-production and production. That there's a kind of a big demand and pull for that. These are all kind of evolutions of the consolidation mechanism, and then lots and lots and lots of machine learning being used to automate micro tasks for the developers. Right? There's a lot of anything that we do of a repetitive nature, and repetitive would be 3 times in one sitting. If you do that same thing, it's immediately subject to some form of automation. Call it a robotic pair program or whatever that may be. And so increasingly using that across the entire spectrum, whether it's unit tests or security testing or maybe authoring some code or filling it in, whatever that may be, those are going to show up. That'll be a mega trend as well.
Definitely. What about the API first economy? You spoke on, productizing APIs and 1 trillion different endpoints around the world. Where is that going?
Probably to 2 trillion. But look, I don't think there's going to be a software system built anymore that is not API first. Well, mostly because APIs are, one, a universal user interface, right? It's more universal than a GUI in that sense. And 2, it's semantically structured. And when you have something that's semantically structured, then it lends itself to automation. You can start having bots interact with that. And so, I just look at the world and go, okay, because of that, everything needs to move to something that's semantically structured so that we can do higher forms of automation in the future.
And do you think the recent changes with inflation and increasing developer salaries, is that going to impact the API economy? Is it going up? Is it going down?
Um, inflation causes higher wages, which is good for our industry.
Hmm.
There will probably be a period over the next 5 years where talent wages rise at probably an unsustainable rate. And so you're going to have a whole class of companies where their R&D and cost of goods sold has, gotten to levels that's not sustainable itself. And so there'll be a backlash. And so organizations are going to be forced to figure out ways to maintain the same level of software with fewer headcount,
Hmm.
right? Or there's going to be downward salary pressure on, people at some point in time.
So what should a founder in 2022 be doing today if he or she is starting a developer tools company?
As a founder doing today, um, uh, so first of all, there's heard the refrain that every time there's been a downturn or a peak in inflation, that there's a massive opportunity for innovation. And the reason that the innovation tends to happen at this sort of level is that when there is a slight recessionary period, what happens is companies tend to pull back on their budgets, and when they start pulling back on their budgets, the priorities of what things they need to buy really become evident. So in 2018, 2020, when markets were super hot, people were buying anything, right? And so, it didn't even matter whether it was in the budget or not. They were like, hey, if they think they could do it, they could buy it. And so it creates a little bit of a fog on what software is really needed and what's not. So if you're starting a company today, if you can really understand the pain points to the point where they will still buy it in this sort of economy, then it really tells you that it's a massive pain point. It's something that probably is not being solved anywhere else, and that is going to be, a really big opportunity to go and chase. So I think that's the biggest trick, is somebody has to really feel the real pains, and then they have to envision how that becomes a 10-year transformational business on that front, and they'll be okay.
And how should these founders be reaching these developers? They're notorious to not listen to sales emails, marketing emails. What is the best approach?
Um, I think that to me, the best approach is you got to build something and put it out there and see who uses it, right? That's and then just, grind away at that. And listen, you got to ship something, and then you got to really listen to the feedback that you get, because the one thing about developers is we build tools for ourselves, which means that we're also susceptible to falling in love with the tool that we built for ourselves. And it's really hard for us to truly listen to what the market's telling us and then embrace that. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Indeed, indeed. What about open source and open core? How does this fit into the developer-led landscape? Is it has the same impact as the developer tools that you're mentioning earlier?
Boy, you're really hitting upon the juicy ones. So, I haven't written about this yet, but this is a personal thing. This is not a representation of Dell Technologies
disclosure.
Capital. I've started to come to the conclusion that that open source as a business model we're going to see a lot of blown up VC money that has gone into that. If I think back over the past 5 years, there's a lot of VCs that are out there where their only criteria for throwing $5 or $10 million at it was how many GitHub stars do they have, and do we think that the founders are credible people? And there's a lot of open source projects that got 3, 5, 10,000 stars at a very quick introduction, and suddenly they've raised $20 million, have a team of 20 people, and they don't even have a commercial product on this front. And it used to be, 10 or 15 years ago, if you were in the top 1% of GitHub stars, that was an indication of true community that you've got, and that was going to be an early predictor of broad infrastructure adoption for that technology. Unfortunately, I think that now that has changed, and that what early GitHub star success signals for you is a lot of free marketing. It's a lot of free marketing, but it's not a business model on that front. And because what we've seen is that there's plenty of open source projects that try to be open core, but over time, the line between what's core, the proprietary stuff that you can sell, and the open source erodes. And so for companies that are 7 to 15 years old that have been in and around a particular type of open source, they find it harder and harder to sustain their commercial operations, even to the point of having enough revenue to be able to fund the open source project. And so as a result of that, I think that the companies who are focused on sustainability have started to realize that open source license might not be a forever thing. It might be good for the first 5 years of the project, and then a license change in order to focus on sustainability of the project. So we saw Mongo, Redis. I'm on the board of a company that's about 30 days away from changing their license from Apache license to something that's not Apache. I ran a company for a number of years that was Apache licensed. They're probably going to make a change as well. And these are all companies that are older than 7 years. They have commercial businesses. They have large, huge ecosystems. Like the company that I'm on the board of is going to make a change. They've got something like 10 million downloads a month, but but they're just not able to fulfill all the needs of the ecosystem and all the changes that need to be made, and the ecosystem's not giving back on that front. And so there's a bargain that they have to make. And there's a lot of licenses that are out there that can still honor the original roots and give a lot of free usage of the software, but really compel the companies that can pay and are using the software to to contribute back so that this ecosystem can thrive on that front. And giving back could be in the form of money, or it could be like, hey, you really have to make contributions. If you're not going to make contributions, then give us money. But if you make contributions, then great, then you get certain rights with that. So I think that we're going to see the recognition that open source is a great marketing approach to build awareness and to validate the technology, but it's not a commercial model.
So besides revenue then, and besides GitHub stars, what are the indicators you look at as an investor? Is there anything in particular, and what should founders be thinking about?
Definitely how customers are adopting it, why they, and not just that they adopted it, but really why. Mm-hmm. How did they find it? What were their motivations? What did they get rid of? Right? Why did they get rid of that thing? How did they allocate the budget? And is that thinking process replicable to a large category of other potential buyers? That's by far the most important thing. And we can even do that for companies that don't even have a product. There's ways to do that. That's one. The second is the team, the leadership team, and spending a lot of time understanding how they deal with adversity. How do they think? How do they kind of draw interesting conclusions and doing analysis with imperfect data about complex, dynamic markets on that front? So, getting into their head and really, reasoning that they're, thoughtful, articulate, capable, driven leaders, dealing with a range of different issues gives you certain confidence about that over the years, and they go through different cycles and growth and whatever that may be, that they're in a position to be able to embrace that change and then react to it and grow from that. That's a pretty big deal. And then definitely looking at how well aligned their ideas fit within the theses that we're targeting on that front, right? Sometimes you find things that are just completely outside the thesis, and it's like, well, that's great. You're probably going to be a fantastic business, but I don't know if I can help you, because if you're not within the thesis, I don't know what kind of value I can bring to the table for you.
And what do you think as a founder, they keep hearing all these different terms like developer first, product-led growth, bottoms-up SaaS. What does that mean, and what should they be thinking about as they think about their go-to-market for these types of companies?
Yeah, so product-led growth is a great coined term to reflect and represent a different essentially marketing motion. Mm-hmm. Okay, the traditional inside sales motion was pretty well structured, driven by a sales leader. Where they have this idea that we're going to have leads, right? And leads are usually email addresses, and then those those leads transition through some sort of activity into a marketing qualified lead, right? Which is some activity that marketing drove them to complete, and then those turn into sales qualified leads when there's a human that talks to them and qualifies that, probably does some BANT analysis, and then it turns into an opportunity when you know that there's a budget, there's a need, there's timing. And so it's a very structured funnel of things that you do. And that was the inside sales motion. And what you realized is that there's a large categories of markets and products where there are people who are willing to spend money on those products, but they have no desire to go through that motion, right? They don't want to give you their email address. They certainly don't want to be contacted by some 25-year-old business development rep who doesn't know what they're talking about in their particular domain. They certainly don't want to be added into a database where there's a sales executive wondering how many tens of thousands of dollars he's going to get out of you and when that's going to close, right? And they have to get through all that process probably just so they can interface with the solution engineer because they have a bunch of technical questions that they might want to ask. So there's all kinds of products where there's people who have real dollars that they can spend, they have buying authority, but they don't want to go through that. So the PLG motion is just a nomenclature that acknowledges that there's products where people will self-discover on their own. They want to learn and educate themselves on their own. They might even want to sign up and engage and start using the product, either anonymously or maybe volunteer some identity to do that. That might be a fake email or an email with a dot in it, so that they can put all the marketing literature into a folder. And they want to maybe even start making usage on that. And that's the funnel that they want to go through. And then they still want to have questions and have those questions get answered, but they want to do it on their terms. In a medium that is asynchronous to the way that they're working, not to the way that the company is working. And so PLG is an acknowledgement that you can actually build really engaged users and customers just by following that motion. And you have to rethink the entire workflow so that the sales and marketing organization structures things very differently. And it also flows into the product itself, because the product, from the moment that you get to the website and how they engage you, has to recognize that and engage the user along that workflow as well.
So great. We don't need salespeople, nor do we need marketing.
I didn't say that.
Or do we still need sales?
Well, what PLG does is it just validates that you get usage, engagement, and even growth. But that growth may come in terms of volume or advanced usage. And generally, that there may need to be a company-to-company relationship that's established. So in that situation, your marketing and salespeople, the people who are tracking all this sort of stuff, might be there to fulfill that portion of the process as opposed to the original establishment.
So what, as a sales rep, should they be doing, and when should they engage with these leads at a PLG company?
Well, I think, first of all, it's incumbent upon the management of that company to really rethink this flow and define, when these people are going to engage and how they're going to engage. But the time that a salesperson might start to get involved is when you're seeing changing rates of engagement and usage, right? So if it's growing and growing and growing, that's probably a signal of something. If you start to see a cluster of users that come from a similar industry or maybe even the same company, that might also be indicative of something, and that there's some value add by grouping them or consolidating them together. And those are probably the good early triggers. It also might be a change in usage on that. So somebody might be coming along and using really basic features, and then suddenly it leapt and there's a complete change and they're using a lot of advanced features. That's a signal of something as well. So I think those are the sorts of things that are going on. And then the salespeople really need to be doing a lot more, or at least with the marketing people, in demographic analysis of the users itself, because there's all sorts of interesting metadata you can find out about the populations, and that metadata can go into sales, and maybe sales can reach out to certain companies and engage at a higher level without disrupting the individuals who are making use of the system. So it's a completely different mindset of how you build the business.
Awesome. So it sounds like sales reps are looking at the usage versus just who the person is. Maybe they're looking at MOSIF, looking at our account-based dashboards. But what should marketing be doing then? Is it all Facebook ads, LinkedIn ads, something different?
Well, that you're presuming that marketing's job is to first bring new people in.
Yep.
But the more important job of marketing is to figure out why. So if you've got a bunch of usage on the system, I bet you 99% of companies that have usage-based systems, they really don't know why people are there, right? They know that they're there. They might know where they came from, but do you know why? Because you think about it, for a developer, say there's a developer who signs up for your service and they did it at 2:30 in the morning, and they're located in, let's say they're Ukraine, right? So they're in the middle of a war zone. They signed up at 2:30 in the morning, and they start making a bunch of use, and they come back 3 days in a row. What's going on in that person's life where out of everything that he could be doing and spending his time, that he took the time to go sign up to that site, he must have something really important going on. And so understanding that full context of everything that led up to how they finally discovered you, got in, took the time to sign up, why did they stay or go, that's the most important thing marketing can do. And one of the things I think, startups, in boards that I'm on, a lot of presenters will come and say, I'm looking for investment. Here's my ideal customer profile. They give us a slide. It says ICP on it. And they're usually pretty articulate about it, but they present it as if it's a static thing. But the ICP is not. It's a living thing. It changes. Every time you get a new sign up, your definition of your ICP is the collection of everybody who's ever been to your system and left. So every time you get a credit card purchase or somebody who churns on you and leaves, your ICP is changed. So if you reposition marketing as the owners of the ICP, they need to be building systems and mechanisms where they can really give an up-to-the-minute, real-time, complete analysis of your total ideal customer profile, because it's constantly changing on you. And that should be marketing's job, because then they can design the programs and the campaigns that line up with that.
How do they do that though? That's very hard, it sounds like.
If they can truly understand the why, if you truly understand the motivations, the behaviors of what brought people there, everything else is easy.
Awesome, awesome. So on the flip side of things, what are PLG companies doing wrong, and what should they be doing instead?
What are PLG companies doing wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
or maybe is it an overhyped or overblown term that every company is now going after?
well, I don't think every business is suited to this workflow that I talked about, right? Is your product really something that people want to self-service and engage on, or are you just using it as a marketing term on that front? Um, uh, so, so I think there's some issues with that. I think that it's not that companies are doing things wrong, but I think that PLG as a concept is so new that people are still figuring out the best practices of it. Here's one difference, right? When you have an inside sales motion, the traditional inside sales motion, you have a separation between your system of record for the customer, which is managed by sales and marketing, and I'm sorry, of the prospect and the opportunity. That's the CRM system. That's your system of record for that. And then you've got your system of record for the customer, which is post sales, right? And that's professional services, customer success, and everything. And they're separate systems, right? And they're managed independently of each other. And then there's all this complication about trying to correlate it against each other. And that makes sense because systems tend to line up around how organizations are structured. But in a PLG company, there's no reason to have a separation of those systems that are there. And in fact, the only system that you need is a system of interaction. And every interaction you have, whether it's with the person has bought or not, that's just a piece of moment. All those things should be tickets. And those tickets should be in a ticketing system that follows, where there's some mechanism by which people follow up. And so when you just look at it from that basic point of view, it's a complete inversion of how all of these systems are set up. And so most companies haven't figured that out yet, and they have to rethink all their systems, how their people interact, and how this information flows to the organization. So if they're doing anything wrong, it's that they haven't figured that out yet.
So it sounds like it's a tooling problem, and make sure it's set up correctly, right?
Absolutely. By the way, I have a couple of investments in that space.
No worries, no worries.
Yeah.
So my last question is really around where do you see the VC market going, especially in the dev tools space, and what should founders be thinking about as we go into the rest of 2020 and into 2021? I know there's a lot of questions around interest rates, the VC markets, and so on.
Yeah, the VC, there will not be as much VC flowing into companies this year as there was last year. I think that's a known artifact. If we look at how much less, so there was $300 billion of VC that was deployed last year. That was a record. If we compare this to the 2001 pullback, which I think that might be a little bit extreme, but in the 2001 pullback, it took 24 months from the peak of the VC outflow to the trough of it, and it was a 90% decrease. So it was 120 billion of outflow, and then 2 years, it was 24 months later, it was roughly 12 to 20 million on that.
So are we going to 90% too?
So if the same thing were to happen here, we'd go from $300 billion of outflow to 30 billion, and it would be sometimes in 2023 or 2024 that we'd bottom. I don't think that that's going to happen. I do think that we're going to probably get to like 60 or 70 billion dollar run rate, which it sounds like a pretty big decrease from 300, but 300 was an asymptotic increase. And even if we get down to $60 billion a year, that's still more than 2014. So it's still higher than, after the recovery, and it's a pretty high rate on that front. So I think we're going to see a normalization on that front. You're going to see investors' valuations are going to come down. There's going to be a much higher diligence cycle that VCs demand. So entrepreneurs are not going to, they can't show up at one or two meetings and expect a decision. So they're going to have to talk to customers. They're going to have to do diligence on the team. They're going to have to do diligence on the ideas. So you're going to have to do more work on that front. And you really have to come with a much stronger concrete definition of what the pain point is and the opportunity that you're going to chase. And I think that sounds tough, but I think it just normalizes it back to where the average is, because I think the past 36 months it got a little bit too, it was pretty founder friendly.
It was, and hopefully you're already doing those things anyways. You better already have that stuff. So
well, look, VCs always run a diligence process, but there was also deal timing and pacing and everything like that, and it got a little fast.
Cool. Well, I'm going to open it up to the floor real quick if anyone has questions for, and then we'll end our meetup. Larry?
Yeah, not that I'm in marketing or anything. You mentioned that marketing should be the owner of ICPs, and marketing should truly understand why the customer came to you. Besides interviewing the CEO or product manager for a case study, is there a magic tool that marketing could deploy to understand?
No. The only tool that truly you have to spend face time with every user. There is no substitute for dialing on the phone. You expect the salespeople to be dialing all day long. Marketing should be dialing all day long and spending as much face time with users as humanly possible. That is the only solve.
Go ahead.
So my question is about market, how market is trending right now it's down, and the opportunities for developer tools companies. So from your experience, have you seen any correlation or anti-correlation between the layoffs in the industry and the developer tools ramping up?
Yeah. So his question was, is there a correlation to the success of developer tools companies and the cycles of growth versus contraction in the normal economic cycle that we exist in? And the answer is yes. JetBrains was started just before 2001, right? That's a $400 million revenue company worth billions of dollars, right? Never been profitable from the very beginning, and that is the ultimate in developer tools companies. GitHub was started in 2005, and 2005 was not, it was pretty, developer tools in this general, people were not willing to invest in these things. They were not considered attractive opportunities by investors at that point in time. And they spent 3 years just heads down grinding out the first version of that product. There are lots of examples. I can go on and on and on. The best developer tool products are always the products that are built by people who have their own problem, and you're solving your own problem. Like the best companies are always, so you got to take something that is recent, current, acute, and a really hard problem. And it's almost always the case that it's 2, 3, or 4 very passionate developers who are close with each other, who have like-minded values, beliefs, and I can identify with the same problem. And they just go heads down. Either they self-fund or they get a small amount of VC money, and then they take 2, 3, or 4 years to just crank out an ideal solution on that. And you need to make sure that the solution is grounded in first principles. The first principles have to be on some technology disruption. It can't be from your gut. There's got to be some grounded technology. Otherwise, developers are not going to adopt it. If it's not grounded in some technology first principle design, other developers won't accept it. But if you do that and you hold true to your principles and then you build this solution and emerge, great companies come from that.
And you brought up quality assurance, and I was wondering, what have you seen in terms of trends in quality assurance? Anything?
Yeah, it's interesting. The QA space is probably one of the most competitive segments. Like if you go through my database and you get to the QA section, you will fall asleep by trying to just read through all the different QA companies that are there. And it makes sense as to why. And there's only a couple of really large QA companies, and they're not even that large. And we're talking like Tricentis and Sauce Labs, a Browser Stack is another. There's some others out there, but the reason why that it's so competitive is, and by the way, the revenues associated with it is something like $8 billion, and it's like $1 or $2 billion just on the software front, and another 8 to 10 billion in just human QA stuff. It's ridiculous.
Is that what you're saying?
It's pretty big for this segment. It's big, yeah. And it's become so competitive because if you think about what testing is you have to cover you write something, right? A unit of something, and the testing has to cover the surface area of that. So testing by definition is an in order issue compared to the writing of the thing. And so there's a lot more tests. There's a lot of variety of tests that you've got to do. The nature of the complexity of those things is pretty increased. And so it just creates lots of opportunities for how are we going to handle all this? And that's why there's so many different kind of testing vendors. So lots of testing vendors. Very few number of them are large. A lot of testing vendors in the $1 to $20 million revenue space, where they have a really novel idea and it's kind of needed, and they can sell it kind of okay, but it doesn't become a worldwide phenomenon. I told you all this because if my theory of autonomous development really emerges, where software can be built and maintained by machines without human intervention, if that were to really emerge, I don't believe it's going to come from the GitHub CoPilots and the Tab 9s of the world, even though they're creating software today. I think it's going to come from the QA space. And why it'll come from the QA space is that machine learning, there's already 24 companies, and the reason I know it's 24 because I studied this just this past week. There are 24 QA companies out there that are using machine learning in some form or fashion to automate either the construction of tests, the maintenance of tests, how those tests execute, reevaluating, identifying new tests that might need to be built either by a human or whatever that is. And I think that when you look at the sort of techniques they have to use to build those sort of machine learning in that, it's the same techniques that we would want to use to actually write the software as well eventually. So they're just going to be so well primed. And the way that those systems all work is that there's some sort of intent language. So some QA person has to come along. They have to describe, I'd like my tests to be able to do this and validate in this way. So they're describing kind of a meta intent, and then the machines figure out what they need to do. So lots of companies competing on that front. And the reason there's lots of companies competing on that front is because most of this space, like 8 billion of it, is humans that are mostly offshore, right? And they're just all subject to automation. I mean, you'd be surprised at how many hundreds of thousands of people that are paid to, still do manual testing. It happens. It's all over the place. And so because there's so many dollars available, I think that machines will go there first because you can get those dollars. That's very different than on the construction space. There's not as many dollars available. We have professional software engineers to the tune of 22 million on the planet who love to write code, want to write code, and so they're not as going to be easy to automate away as it will be the QA engineers. So it's a very exciting space. The only downside is, and no offense to all my QA friends out there who are going to watch this and yell at me, generally when I look at the talent of people who go and join QA companies, it's generally a different kind of talent than the people who go and create developer tool companies on that. And it makes sense. You're an engineer. You create code. You want to go on to the engineering side. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, you go on to that side. The QA side is not the first place that people think about, but that's where the money is.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Super amazing big picture. Thanks for sharing that. So we were talking about automation and how the world's changing post this peak. And of course, there's now funding issues for developer companies or developer tool startups. Of course, the world's contracting. But do you also see that there might be a silver lining because now the big tech is sort of developers are now one of the most expensive resources as well, and we see that there's outflow of that as well. And do you see that automation and something like, for example, SDKs and these sort of toolings, developer toolings, can really help take the opportunity and help this sort of scenario where developers can now do more with these tools?
I think that there's many forms of automation. Automation is an investable category. I just think of it, it's probably a 5 to 7 year horizon of return. And I think the returns are capped because when you deal with automation in the current paradigm of the agile principles, there's only so much you can automate. And those automation companies, in order for them to be a VC investable return, which is different than a sole proprietor level return, we're thinking in terms of billion-dollar outcomes and how many companies can have a billion-dollar outcome. And the issue is that if you're building automation at the same time the mega vendors are building platform consolidation, that automation is in direct competition to the platform consolidators who have pricing power over you. So as an investor, you have to be very, very selective about which automation it is. As a developer in our ecosystem, all these automation solutions make a ton of sense. They're probably going to do okay as businesses, but for a VC to make money on it, it's got to overcome these fundamental dynamics of these platform consolidators that are out there. That's a trickier space to be in.
Oh yes. Where do you think the software developer interview process and career ladder is going generally? Because in the past 15 years, it's been fairly formulaic with being tested on algorithms, data structures, and system design, and it's given rise to toxic communities such as Team Blind, where people their software developers just cramming away and studying for interviews all the time.
Yeah.
And always complaining and trying to find these jobs in big companies where they can quote unquote post. So do you think that will continue? Do you think there will be other models such as actually wanting domain specific knowledge on a particular tech stack?
I think that I'm kind of mortified if that's really become the engineer interview process, which is show up and do leak code and demonstrate that you can do some esoteric algorithm from your computer science notebook. I'm kind of mortified if that's what our industry has become. I read about that all the time. I just assume that it wasn't happening because it's so stupid. Look, I believe if I were to start my next company and I was going to build an engineering organization again, the most core principles under which I'd be recruiting under is culture and team fit, which has nothing to do with how you write your code, right? And culture and team fit is a question of are we going to enjoy spending 10 years of our life together here? Are you going to enjoy spending 10 years of your life with the people that are going to be around you, and do they feel the same way about you on that front? That's really more important thing. Second, are you going to be somebody who can grow, meaning we're going to be able to put you in an environment that causes you to become a better whatever you want to be, and that we're going to be a better whatever we're going to be on that. That's, I spend a lot of time testing for that. The interview panel should be testing for that. And then, obviously, you need to demonstrate competency in the domain that you're in, but that competency is usually demonstrated by a track record of what you've previously done, which, by the way, most of that's in the open domain, so easy to go and investigate that, or reference calls that you do. So, and then fourth, I think it's incumbent upon management or whoever's setting up that organization to not focus on speed or revenue or these business metrics, but to recognize that you got to focus on sustainability. And so sustainability means sustainability of the software, sustainability of your customers, and sustainability of the people who are building it. And so I would be telling my vice president of engineering, let's set up an interview process that are based on those 4 principles. And I bet you if you do that and everybody comes on board, meets that, it's a wonderful team, and I bet you produce wonderful software.
Do you have one more?
Yeah,
Go
actually,
ahead.
2 things, but fantastic speech. It's a bit like the time seems to be perfect for where we're at. But going back to sort of the sort of developer-centric approach, and you talked about sort of the self-exploration that developers love to go through. They
Yeah.
don't want to be bothered by sales and marketing. Totally get it. I'm kind of that person myself too. There's a huge challenge, and I'd love your perspective on it, is when you open it up and you let someone in to go self-explore, but there's so much depth to that particular solution that they kind of get lost in the center.
Yep.
Versus shutting that off and forcing them down another path to maybe talk to a sales engineer, whatever it is. I don't know if you have a perspective, because that's kind of right where we are.
So I said that it's incumbent upon the company to design a system of engagement that allows the developer to asynchronously engage on their terms, right? Part of that means that the system needs to have the hooks and observability built into it so that you can determine, whether that developer is potentially about to walk over a tripwire, and to give them, levers that they can pull to go and get that sort of help.
That means simplistic.
Yeah, and that's really, so I kind of glossed over that, but yeah, that has to be designed into the system. And so it can't just be, hey, here it is, and hope that they figure it out on their own. The product managers, whoever the product managers are, really have to, hopefully get a huge database of information from marketing that is constantly talking and building up this ICP, and that they can look into that and design a better software system that has those catches and those tripwires built into it. Does this make sense?
Totally agree. And I love speaking on guardrails. You're trying to help a developer go down a certain path. And then if you do see, some type of indicator where they're struggling, maybe, you have an automated email. Hey, it looks like you are struggling. These are some tutorials or something that can help out with your problem. Or, hey, there's someone here available to, speak with on some of the problems that you're having. Happy to, jump on a call. But it's not about forcing the product onto that developer, but allowing them to explore on their own. When they're ready, they can raise their hand and say, hey, I need help. Or it looks like you need some help there. Cool. Go ahead.
It's about the companies like Amazon, like public clouds, copying basically some successful development tools, right, and then running with it. And it's kind of one form of consolidation of which you've been.
Fair point. It is. Yep.
Consolidation that the
You don't think being a fast follower and offering it at a cheap commodity price is consolidation? It's not really so much consolidation as share shifting. I mean, they're taking share from an expensive vendor and they're providing it, on a cheaper basis there. No, I don't consider that consolidation. But that is a legitimate form of business, which is fast following at a cheaper commodity price. I mean, it's basically an 80% knockoff and at a 50% of the price. So was your question the legality of that, or was it more about the?
It's legal since it's happening, and
Yeah.
Amazon, I don't know how you can get at Amazon, but how let's say one of your portfolio companies.
Yeah.
Could they protect themselves from such a?
The answer is yes, and they one, there's a couple of ways that they're protecting themselves. If you are an open source company, even though I was kind of critical on it as a marketing model, a lot of open source companies are skipping open core and going immediately to managed hosting service on that. And so if you go immediately to managed hosting service and you don't, like, hey, we're not going to compensate on any sort of software that you install. If you like our open source software, you got to sign up for our cloud service. And so if they can do that and build really strong engagement and lock in workflow, then they're a little bit immune from the copycats at the hyperscalers on that front. So that's one technique that they do. The other technique is fundamentally changing. If you have the copyright, which most commercial companies do to the open source, one of the things that the copyright gives to you, and this is why everybody has to sign a CLA, a contributor license agreement. When you're signing that contributor license agreement, you're basically giving your copyright to that company. And the most fundamental thing that copyright holders can do is change the license, right? And so I have a very permissive license. I see what Amazon is doing to mine. So we're going to take that core and we're going to license it to something that prevents Amazon from making use of it. But that tends to only and it happens pretty successfully. Redis, MongoDB, MariaDB was mentioned. I'm probably going to gloss over it, but
Elasticsearch just did
Elastic,
that too.
thank you very much. Thank you. Elasticsearch just did it. You said something. You said Elastic as well. So big companies. And MinIO. Anybody out here use MinIO? A huge S3. Yeah, they relicensed 3 times before they found the one that worked for them. CockroachDB. CockroachDB is on the BSL. They relicensed, so that's a pretty big one. I'm sure I'm figuring, So by relicensing, and it doesn't tend to happen early. It tends to happen after they have, again, been 5 to 7 years and they've got a real thriving community, and then you can relicense. And so it really basically says, hey, you can do a knockoff, but you're either going to have to give money or you're going to have to give real contributions back. And that, and the company who has the copyright can force that trade-off to take place.
Just changing the license is already like a big standpoint in protecting your.
It's a step that the board will carefully analyze and look at. But yeah, it's a step that you can take. And 5 years ago, it was considered a like the third rail. What's the third rail of politics, right? It was considered an untouchable thing. You would never change the license because the open source fanatics are going to come after you. They're going to eat your children. And now it's happened enough where I think people recognize that, yeah, if I'm getting the software for free, if they want to change the license because they need to make some money, okay, on that front.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Tyler, for coming in today and speaking on his developer-led landscape. We'll be in the back, just having some pizza. There's additional drinks if you would like to have some. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Derek.